Hello there. Online news and journalism and streaming services, that is Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hotstar, all of those will now be under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting from the previous Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. What does this mean for you and me? And to explore that and more, let's talk to Nikhil Pahwa. He's the founder editor of Medianama and perhaps the best person in India most qualified to talk about this. Nikhil, all that praise aside, my first question is a very simple question, which is we saw the notification today. For the average person, it just seems like all these departments have gone from one government body to another government body. I mean, it doesn't seem to be anything more than procedural at first glance. So, what's the meaning of all this?
Well, to understand that, you have to understand, what the intention has been. So, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting has been wanting to regulate streaming services. They have said that they support a self-regulatory mechanism, but the Ministry of IT has actually had that jurisdiction. And from what I understand, it hasn't really had the intent to regulate streaming services because it doesn't do any kind of content regulation.
Right.
So it's more they Ministry of IT looks more at takedown of, let's say, certain sites of apps. It sort of looks at Section 69, which was used to ban the Chinese apps. It doesn't look at content regulation. I&B, it is their bread and butter. It is why I&B exists. It's kind of like India's Ministry of Truth, where they want content to conform to a particular Indian culture. They wanted to conform to a particular set of standards. They are the ones who effectively, if you think about it, if content has to be regulated, the jurisdiction needs to lie with them. So what this means essentially is that it's very likely that there is going to be a ministry pushed, or a ministry dictated, or a ministry sort of determined self-regulatory code that streaming services will conform to. What this means for users is that even though they are viewing something privately and it's not broadcast like TV, it will still be regulated according to certain guidelines. So you might find scenes are censored, you might find censorship of some sort in terms of subtitles. For example, today on television, the word breasts is not used. There are several phrases that are there in English films that are not being used. Now, streaming services don't have those restrictions because they're private viewing. So you might find that some of this will bring streaming services potentially closer to TV, and that process is just beginning now. So
Right,
this is
right.
early
Okay.
days. We don't know how it's going to end up, but the fact is that TV also began with minor changes and minor regulations, and look at where it is now, where it's just supposed to be wholesome entertainment and largely unwatchable to my mind.
Okay, so that's an important point. It's not a single event, but a continuum, and this is just one thing, and other changes will or likely to unfold from here. Nikhil, what you said made me think of the book. So nobody can tell me today what book I can read or what book I can buy. But the way you've explained it to me, it makes me feel like now it seems like there is an opening for the government to say you can't watch this individual show because essentially what I watch is not what you watch and not what the other person watches. Is that really the case? Is it like the government potentially having the control to dictate what book I can choose to read?
Well, look, I don't know whether we'll go down that path, but India does have a history of banning books.
No,
Um,
just as an analogy, sorry, and not I
I
didn't
know,
mean
I,
specifically.
I know, but I think what will happen is that there might be certain shows which don't get aired. For example, Hotstar on its own, from what I remember, decided not to air a show that was critical of the Prime Minister. So there are instances historically, even in case of YouTube, where there was a documentary film on the Delhi rape case, which was banned in India, and YouTube also had to block access to it. So I think there are instances where the certain content which is available to the rest of the world might not be available to us in India going forward. We're not there yet, but that's definitely a possibility down the road.
Okay, well, we'll come to the other areas you mentioned previously, which is of course jurisdiction and censorship. But content-wise, are all types of content, will all types of content be seen as the same? I mean,
Yeah.
again, keeping in mind that this is just the first step.
So look, the IT Act itself doesn't define a streaming service. IT, which is the IT Act is the government governing law for streaming services, and so as such, I don't see how MIB can even regulate content on it. In fact, if you think about it, the IT Act largely focuses on intermediaries, which allow one entity to stream content or share updates and content and posts and text, etc., using those intermediaries as platforms. So I don't see the difference between, let's say, an ISP acting as an intermediary for a Netflix versus YouTube acting as an intermediary for me publishing a video there, right? So
Right.
Netflix and I, under law, are equal. The IT Act doesn't envisage any difference between us. So effectively, censorship of whatever censorship rules may apply to a Netflix would also apply to you and me and our speech in a sense. And that for me is a bit of a cause for concern. But the other aspect is what I mentioned about private viewing. You know, a few years ago, in the Supreme Court, when there was a petition from Kamlesh Vaswani for banning porn, at that point in time, the government of India had gone and given an undertaking saying
Right.
that they don't want to get into someone's bedroom and control what they do there. What people are doing privately is their business. And I don't see fundamentally, structurally, the difference between porn and any other content streaming services apart from the content. And there is no differentiation in content that is envisaged. So why should the government want to come into my bedroom and control what I watch on Netflix or what I watch on Amazon Prime or what I watch on Hotstar? So I see that there is a discrepancy here, there is a hypocrisy here with MIB trying to impose this code, and streaming services seem to be pretty open to the idea of conforming to a government code.
Yes, we've seen that. Of course, we've seen that in the case separately in platforms as well, who let go of certain controversial elements, shall we say, on their platforms in order to make sure that they get business. But
Look, this
specifically,
is a
Nikhil,
country. This is a country where something that you produce or something that you say is bound to offend at least someone, and so it's
yes,
important for regulations to actually protect our right to offend, because everyone's going to get offended anyway, and that shouldn't be a benchmark for censorship or a benchmark for allowing or disallowing certain content. Yes, regulate incitement to violence. Yes, regulate hateful speech, but something that someone might find offensive or may not conform with their values isn't anybody else's business when I'm watching it privately. So I think we have to be very careful about what happens from here on. The thing with streaming services, Venkatesh, is that streaming services basically don't want to take on the government. They don't want to go to court against the government. They are already facing lawsuits against various shows for various reasons. Many lawsuits have even gotten thrown out in the past, frankly. But there is increasing litigation because there are busybodies that go and file cases. They want to treat streaming services like cable. And so, streaming services feel that if there are regulations that are blessed by the government, or if there is a code that is blessed by the government, then there will be some semblance of protection for them in courts. So they're not without reason either. My only problem is, what about my rights as a viewer, as a user? The streaming services are not going to fight for my right to view, but someone should.
right. My next question is about jurisdiction, and specifically, I mean, not just from MeitY to the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, but also does this impact a post that I make on Facebook, for instance, or a post that I make on Twitter? It doesn't, from what I understand, this doesn't cover that at all.
It doesn't cover that because I mean we don't know how the ministry is going to define streaming services, and frankly, Twitter, for example, allows for the live streaming of this discussion between you and me. So we're
Yes.
not sure how they will define streaming services because, the beauty of the internet, and I wrote this article when we were defending net neutrality in India, that imagine a billion television channels. It's not possible in cable, but it is possible online. The freedom that
Yes.
you and I have to create content without having a regulatory overhang, without trying to get an uplinking license is liberating. And that's the kind of internet that we want. I'm afraid that kind of a situation might be under threat going forward.
Okay, I want to bring up a thought experiment or a sort of
Hmm.
an example for which is, let's say today if I were to, let's say I was from the Adivasi community. I wanted to write about the Adivasi community's issues.
Hmm.
I could just start a blog and
Hmm.
start blogging and ask tough questions of people in government, whether it's state or whether it's district wise, whatever government it is. Are
Hmm.
you saying then that there is potentially the case tomorrow that I will need to seek permission to start this blog of mine?
Um, Again, it depends on how they will define an online media publication.
Right.
And a lot boils down to the definition. Unfortunately, definitions are often quite broad, and then they are implemented or they are utilized as and when the government sees fit. So they will be all encompassing, but they could possibly only be utilized when they need to utilize that definition. It's the way laws and regulations operate in India is that everyone's always breaking some law or the other. So when the government wants, they can throw the rule book at you. And
Yes.
so there isn't much of an ease of doing business. There isn't much an ease of living in this country because you're always at the mercy of arbitrary implementation of arbitrary rules and regulations. So I think we have to wait and watch, but both from a news and a blogging perspective, as well as from a streaming services perspective, um, it looks like there is going to be more regulation coming up.
Yes. Is there anything else you want to talk about, Nikhil? Because we've touched upon the content aspect, the
Yeah.
jurisdiction aspect, also censorship. Are there any questions that need to be asked at this stage, or stuff that we are not seeing, fine print, so to speak?
So, my question is about grounds. The IT Act doesn't define streaming services. So, on what basis are streaming services being defined and being handed over to the Ministry of I&B under what law? That's question number one. Question number two is that, the IT Act itself, when it comes to regulating content, has very limited definitions, and those apply largely to intermediaries. So, how would those definitions and those limits of the IT Act apply uh, to streaming services going forward? It's not very clear. So, I think Prakash Javdekar needs to come clean on what is the intention behind this particular shift, and what is their interest in trying to regulate this space, which was already governed by the IT Act, but really it has given creators so much of freedom to create the kind of content that we as viewers like to watch. I today don't have a cable connection. Everything that I watch is via streaming because that's the kind of content that I would like to watch, and TV will never provide me with that content. So, it's almost like we're in a situation where if it moves, it gets regulated, and this over-regulatory approach from the government is only going to stifle freedoms, is only going to stifle creativity. Um, and to the streaming services, I want to know what they're planning to do about this, because are they just going to blindly conform to whatever the ministry dictates to them? Or are they willing to go to court to take on what seems to be a fairly regressive move?
Right. This is something we'll continue to monitor, and we'll look to you, Nikhil, to provide us, the thought leadership in this space. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks, Venkat. It's a pleasure being here.